Okay, perfect. Welcome, everyone. We are now live for our intersectionality event. We are going to give about 2 more minutes for everyone else to hopefully trickle in, and then we will get started with the event. Thank you guys so much for being here, for those who are. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get rolling on the intersectionality event. Thank you guys so much once again for joining us. My name is Alora, and I am a social media and community outreach intern for WomenNC. This evening, we are going to talk about critical conversations. Let's talk intersectionality. So I am here as, like I said, a social media and communication outreach intern. I am a junior at Harvard studying history, specifically on it, focusing on Indigenous studies and social anthropology. I'm originally from Raleigh, North Carolina, born and raised. And then WomenNC is hosting this event to help educate our community on intersectionality. What is it and why it matters? During the event, if you have any questions, please put them in the Facebook live chat, and we will try to answer them during the Q&A session at the end. Before we get started and hear briefly from our panelists about who they are and their backgrounds, I wanted to tell you a bit about WomenNC. So in 2009, Beth Deggan founded WomenNC to help train and educate people in North Carolina to fight for gender equality. Through advocacy and policy, Beth, our founder, is an Iranian-born activist who has been fighting for gender equality on an international scale. WomenNC's initiatives are our leadership training program, community educations, and cities for CEDAW. WomenNC Scholar Program trains undergraduate students to develop research surrounding gender inequality issues occurring in North Carolina and partners with RTI, Global Gender Center. From there, students formulate low-budget policy solutions and propose them in front of local, statewide, and international changemakers, and relay how these gender issues occurring in North Carolina are also relevant on a global scale. WomenNC also partners with UNC Public Policy to work with a group of students each year on their capstone project, analyzing gender issues in North Carolina and developing policy solutions to improve the status quo. WomenNC spearheaded the cities and counties for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women movement in North Carolina, which seeks to enshrine principles of gender equity into local political deliberative processes. Due in large measure to the organizing and advocacy efforts of WomenNC staff, board, and volunteers, Durham County and Durham City became the first regions in North Carolina to pass resolutions in support of CEDA, which is what we mentioned previously, by respectively creating sustainable mechanisms for ensuring gender equity by requiring them to evaluate their programs and budgets annually to ensure that each addresses barriers to equality faced by women. Lastly, WomenNC likes to promote community education to empower all individuals to advance gender equality in North Carolina. In these short sessions, we provide an overview of critical issues with expert panelists who engage with each other in dialogue, take questions, and comments from our live audience, offer resources for further education, and provide meaningful ways for them to advocate. Now that you know a bit more about me and WomenNC, I will pass off the stage to our 3 amazing panelists. Senator Batch, if you would like to start with your introduction, that'd be fantastic.
Hi, my name is Sydney Batch, and I, for those who are visually impaired, am a Black woman in my 40s, wearing a jumper that is striped with a lot of bright fall colors. I wear lots of hats, not surprising for most women in our lives. I am an attorney, went to Carolina, grew up in Chapel Hill, went to Carolina 3 times. I'm a proud triple Tar Heel. I always say they have all of my love and all of my money. I have my undergraduate degree in English, a master's in social work, and then my Juris Doctorate. After graduating, I went into private practice in Raleigh with my husband. We have a small law firm. And for the past 18 years, I've primarily focused on representing women in particular, but families in the child welfare system, in foster care and abuse, neglect, and dependency, also known as DSS court, and family law, so custody, divorce, etc. I've worn all hats in the juvenile space and have been a guardian ad litem, a child's advocate, parenting coordinator, you name it, I've probably done it. And then when I am not practicing in my law practice, I'm actually at the state legislature. I represent Southern Wake County in District 17 in the state Senate, and do a lot of work in those areas in particular that are my passion, but of course have a very large swath of work and now expertise that I never knew about in representing individuals in the legislature in the towns of Holly Springs, Fuquay, part of Apex, part of Garner, et cetera. So it's really great to be here with all of you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Senator Batch. It's fantastic having you here, and we really appreciate it. Okay, next up, we're going to have Dr. Ariana Vigil introduce herself.
Hi, good evening. Thanks, everyone. Really glad to be here. My name is Ariana Vigil. I am a light-skinned Latino woman with curly brown hair, and I'm wearing a pink shirt tonight. I'm chair and professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. My field of specialty is Latinx, contemporary Latinx literature and culture, and I focus on issues of activism, militarization, and transnationalism. And I also teach classes, sort of broader classes on feminist theory and women's and gender studies.
Thank you so much. Okay, next up we have Vicki Smith.
Good evening. My name is Vicki Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Alliance of Disability Advocates, which is a center for independent living serving the Raleigh-Durham area. I'm a white woman with gray hair and glasses. I prefer he or she or her pronouns, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And I forgot to do the description in the beginning, but I am a 20-year-old white woman with brown hair, and I have an orange shirt on. So my apologies for forgetting that in the beginning. Okay, thank you guys so much for introducing yourselves. We are so happy to have you here, and we are so happy to have those who are watching now on Facebook Live, and then those who are going to be watching in the future. So next off, we're going to go into some questions that we have for each of the panelists. So for Dr. Ariana Vigil, we have a question of what is intersectionality, the history behind it, and kind of some nuances. Like, can you take that away and explain?
Sure. It's a great place to start. So intersectionality is a theoretical tool that is meant to shed light on and encourage us to appreciate the extent to which oppressions are interlinked and simultaneously experienced. So to use a common example, intersectionality points out that Black women do not experience racism in the same way that Black men experience it, nor do they experience sexism the way that white women experience it. Rather, they experience the intersection of racism and sexism simultaneously in their lives, and that this interlocking oppression can't be disentangled, right? So a little more about the history behind it. Like critical race theory, intersectionality grew out of legal scholarship. It's widely credited to and associated with the legal scholar, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, and 2 articles that she published. The first was titled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, and that was published in the University of Chicago Legal Forum in 1989. And then 2 years later, she published an article entitled Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women. And that was published in the Stanford Law Review in 1991. In these articles, and I encourage you to go and read them. They're pretty easy to find, or I'd be happy to send them to you. And they're I will say they're very readable. So don't be put off by the thought of reading legal scholarship. You would have no trouble understanding her key points. So in these articles, Crenshaw is building on arguments that had already been advanced by earlier Black feminist scholars, including Gloria Hall, Patricia Bell Scott, and Barbara Smith. So to sum it up in terms of its history, intersectionality has its roots in Black feminist thought specifically. So Crenshaw and others, of course, they're coming from the legal system. So she was specifically pointing out that existing legal structures were not able to recognize intersectionality, so that a person who was trying to seek redress for a racist, sexist experience in the workplace would have to address only one manifestation of that discrimination, either the racism or the sexism, and that the legal system as it stood was not able to address both simultaneously. So one thing I also want to be clear about is that the theory has always been utilized in such a way as to shed light on the experiences of women of color and multiply marginalized people broadly. So even though it grows from Black feminist thought, it's always been, even by Crenshaw and others, always been talked about in a way to apply to folks who are not Black women. So for example, in Crenshaw's 1991 article, she spends quite a bit of time talking about a Latina woman who is trying to access services for women who have experienced abuse. And she's unable to do so because the structures of the services that she's trying to access require that clients be proficient in English, among other things. So that's another example of the ways in which those structures assume assume a particular identity and experience of oppression that doesn't apply to, in this case, a Spanish dominant woman. And if I can go on to just wrap up with a couple nuances in intersectionality, I'll just say a couple more contemporary things. So one, I feel like from my vantage point, somewhat for better or worse, maybe for both, the term intersectionality has entered the mainstream. And I think that's great. But I also think that there tends to be a sort of inevitable tendency to overuse the word and to maybe misuse it. And apply it in instances where it could be a little bit more specific. So one thing that I see is a tendency to focus on intersectionality as though intersectionality itself is an identity, something that people have, as opposed to an analytical framework and one that is meant to elucidate experiences of oppression. So I've heard people talk about, for example, a person describing somebody as having an intersectional identity when talking about somebody who's mixed race or talking about somebody who is an LGBTQ person of color. And as I've defined it here, the term is really not about identity, but rather about experiences of oppression. And so I would say that all of us have intersectional identities, right? Because we all have race and gender and sexuality and a class standing. So it's not something we have, again, intersectionality. It's something that we utilize to understand experiences of oppression and ideally seek to, ameliorate those experiences. Another thing I want to point out is that intersectionality is also not about engaging in what Betita Martinez calls the oppression Olympics, right? It's not about ranking someone's oppression or saying that this person is more oppressed than this other person because of, this or that identity category. Rather, again, it's really about trying to understand and recognize the where, when, and how experiences of oppression might be manifest in our lives and tied to the different identities that we hold. And finally, I want to give a shout out to a local professor, Professor Jen Nash of Duke University, who also has a really well-known article entitled Rethinking Intersectionality that she published in 2008. And I encourage you to read that as well. And so she has a rethinking of intersectionality and its prominence within feminist theory. So what she talks about in that article is she lays out a few of what she calls tensions with the approach. And some of the tensions that she names are a lack of a defined intersectional methodology and the use of Black women as a quintessential intersectional subject. And again, I want to be clear that Professor Nash is not interested in undermining intersectionality, but rather with refining it and sharpening its analytical reach. So I'll stop there.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for that great explanation and kind of history of what intersectionality is and just a greater understanding to the actual like nature of what intersectionality is, not the identity, but the experience. So thank you so much. Like you said, a lot of people have that misunderstanding. So hopefully, you know, through this live stream and through sharing and through further education, like people can understand what exactly intersectionality is a little better. So thank you so much. Okay, next up we have Vicki Smith from the ADANC. So how is intersectionality important to understand your work for advocacy with individuals with disabilities?
Well, I think people with disabilities are usually they already have some specific rights in laws that protect them, that require that bus routes, facilities, services are accessible to people with disabilities. And I think, of course, that is wonderful to be able to do that. But physical access is just one area of the challenges that people with disabilities meet on a daily basis. And we have disabilities that you can see. A person in a wheelchair, for example, you can see that they have a disability. A person who is using some type of who's blind, visually impaired, they might have a cane or a dog or someone who's helping them navigate a community. But there are a lot of disabilities that are pretty significant and impair people's ability to interact with folks that are invisible. And examples of those would be disabilities like someone living with a mental illness, someone who is a diabetic, someone who has seizures. Those are not always apparent, but sometimes happen in very public places where that behavior is seen as deviant and often misunderstood, and police are called frequently in those situations. I think that there is also an awful lot of discrimination for people with disabilities, and in preference for people who don't have disabilities, because they would be easier to hire, less expensive, fewer hassles. And in our community, we call that ableism. And so we have a word for preferring to hire people without a disability for fear that hiring a person with a disability will be more expensive for the employer. So discrimination and social prejudice also happens to people who are the opposite, who again are perceived as disabled but don't have a disability. So it's like any of these issues, it's very complex. And our work at Alliance of Disability Advocates is to work with people with any type of disability and help them live independently as possible in the community that they choose. So all of our work is helping people achieve their personal goals, to have jobs, live in the community, have family members, get an education, and we're making good progress, by the way. And we do have the advantage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but that doesn't cover it all. So I'll sum it up there and answer questions later.
Yes, thank you so much, Vicki. We really appreciate the insight about the ADAS does cover some, does not cover all. So I definitely understand that. And as someone with invisible disability of having ADHD, then of course having anxiety, those kinds of things aren't as recognized as much as maybe more physical or visible ones, maybe. And so it's definitely important to keep that in mind and remember that the fight for access for all is not over, nowhere near over. And so we really appreciate all the work that you're doing. It means a lot, Vicki. Thank you so much. Okay, next up we have Senator Batch, and she's going to be talking about how intersectionality is important for developing legislation and how it affects her work. So you may take it away.
Thank you. So, in my world, intersectionality, when it is ignored, has, as you guys can imagine, a lot of unintended consequences with regards to the disparate treatment of certain populations, health outcomes, education outcomes, incarceration, et cetera. And so the list goes on and on. So when I think about the type of legislation that is always proposed, and we have thousands of bills that are filed every single year, only 100 or 100 plus make it out of committees. We're thinking about a couple hundred bills a year that may become law. One of the things that I don't think that the legislature spends enough time on are those issues of intersectionality and what happens when they're ignored and we treat everything and everyone like it's the exact same experience. And so an example of that right now would be the Black maternal mortality crisis that we have, an infant mortality crisis. And there's been tons of research on this, and that the outcomes in North Carolina are actually pretty abysmal for all women. We rank at the bottom of the country with regards to health outcomes for women and for infants. But when you start peeling back a lot of the information, the research, et cetera, even when you control for socioeconomic status, even when you control for education and all of the other issues that you would think might be a reason why Black women may die at a higher rate, or their children, what you find is that very little of that actually, none of that actually controls for why we have higher rates of infant and maternal death. A lot of it deals with, some of the research has talked about the disparate treatment and the disproportionate amount of treatment that Black women have just in healthcare and people of color in general. So when you go to a doctor may look at the behaviors or the same symptoms and then look at them differently and diagnose them differently for a person of color than they do for a white person, right? And therefore, the person of color may be a malingerer. So no, they really don't have high blood pressure, they're complaining, or they don't really have pain. Those things end up leading to worse outcomes. Women and children, they end up dying. And so even when access to actual care is taken into effect, you can't make up for all of the other issues that are there. So the easiest way for the legislature to pass legislation is to ignore all of the other challenges that we have, right? With regards to whether or not we can actually have access across the state of North Carolina. In rural North Carolina, there isn't a whole lot of access. If you've got issues with regards to transportation, I mean, we have 61 counties that don't have psychiatrists. Right? Talk about the unseen disabilities across the state when you're talking about people who have significant mental health challenges and they need diagnoses and they need medication and need access to psychiatrists. 61 of our counties out of 100 don't have it, right? The majority of our counties don't have access. And so if we pass legislation acting like everyone is the exact same cookie cutter person, we absolutely are doing a disservice to the vast majority of North Carolinians because of the intersectionality context. Dr. Vigil said, for better or for worse, it's now intersectionality is becoming more popular and it's being discussed. But we have also seen that topics that start talking about race, that talks about inequities, that talks about inequality with regards to gender or with regards to disabilities, ends up being another part of cultural wars that end up getting engaged in and become political footballs. And so I think she probably has, and she can speak for herself, some hesitation on like, yay, my work is finally being recognized. But I also don't want you to undermine or use it as a weapon if you say that we're trying to acknowledge that there are some systems that currently exist in our society that will not allow for people to have equal footing, and more importantly, to just recognize their lived experience, right? So there are a lot of people out here that frankly just don't want to recognize that women have a different time. How I, as a female legislator with 2 young children, of which, by the way, I am in the Senate, there are 17 women. Out of the 17 women, only 2 of us have school-age children. 2, right? So we have a very different experience raising children that are currently in school than my other female colleagues, than my male colleagues. The challenges that we face, the soccer games that I miss, the childcare that I had to pay as compared to some of my colleagues, right, at the legislature who, have said, oh, my wife stayed at home. I'm happy your wife stayed at home. It's not a luxury that every woman can have. It's not a luxury, and that some women do not want to stay at home. They want to work. But what is missed in that conversation is my experience as a female legislator with young children is very different than the experience of one of my other colleagues who doesn't have school-age children and is retired, right? And we lose out on so many of those aspects when we are looking at legislation and not considering the greater, all of the different aspects of people and the complexities and their lived experience. So childcare is a perfect example. Right now, in most places, in like a lot of places in North Carolina, there are childcare deserts. There's a waiting list right now for 2 years in Moore County for an infant spot. And all of us can do the math. If you're waiting for 2 years on an infant spot, clearly you're going to be in the toddler room. So we have women who cannot actually benefit, their careers and their trajectories and what they can do in life is going to be very different if they're not able to find appropriate childcare for their children. But that is not something that a lot of us talk about. And her experience as a working mom versus a working dad's experience, even in a, nuclear family, 2-parent household, is a very different experience. And when we ignore what women, have to go through in those situations, and we ignore the challenges that they face disproportionately, usually having to do the child rearing, even if they're working the exact same amount as their spouse or partner, we are doing a disservice to North Carolinians across the board. And so when I'm looking at a lot of the work that I do in the legislation, I look at intersectionality and I look at what can we do for the greatest good for the vast majority of people? And how can we avoid unintended consequences? Because when we ignore all of these issues, then we are only hurting the greater good, because we're going to be paying for these unintended consequences one way or the other. It's either going to be through a lot of programs that we put in place. It's going to be through mass incarceration. At one way or another, we will be paying for it emotionally, morally, financially, usually all three. And I hope that over time, we get to a point where legislatively and politically, people could disagree without being disagreeable. And we could return to a time where we really try to sit down and negotiate and hammer out the best deal, without trying to do an I gotcha and put somebody on Twitter or Facebook and scream at them, and talk about people's actual experiences are important and they're valid, right? That doesn't mean that you change everything, but you also can consider other people's frameworks and their experience, and the tons of research that we have. Like, we have copious amounts of research out there that show programs that actually work. I personally believe that in government, we should not be putting any tax dollars into programs that are not evidence-based, that do not have outcomes, and that we aren't demanding to see that at the end of the day, the money that we put in actually has a positive return on investment. That is not, sadly, what we're doing right now in the state. I hope that we can get there. But again, I see the world in a very different view. Getting my master's in social work and having to do research classes and understanding evidence and having to, read studies puts me in a very different frame of work than a lot of my colleagues. And that's not to say that their value, they have significant value. We all have a different, we all come from different walks of life, and that's what makes up a good government. But you also shouldn't ignore other people's experiences or the research that's out there that tells us that we can do it a better way, and that will help the most people in that process. So I would just wrap up by saying that a lot of the work that at least I think of in the lens that I view a lot of legislation and how to vote on it is very much from how can we reduce the unintended consequences of legislation that we pass, and how can we do the most good for the most people with the least damage.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Sydney. Yeah, it definitely is a problem when you view legislation as trying to be cookie cutter fit everyone. You're not, like you said, experiencing or looking at the experiences of all and the daily difficulties that they encounter. And so I really wish that we as a country really focused on that more of thinking about how are all people impacted by this? Like, how can we make sure that it's not going to hurt more people? So that's definitely super important to keep in mind. But yeah, thank you, panelists. Now we're going to transition to a question and answer portion of the event. So if you have any questions that you would like to be answered, please plug them into the Facebook live chat. But until then, we are going to start off with some questions that I have. And so we're going to go with Ariana Vigil, and we have a question for her. So your question is, what is one thing you hope folks will take away from this conversation about intersectionality?
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is sort of going on what Senator Batch just said. I think the idea of how do we implement intersectionality to try to address injustice and do the most good. So again, I think I would, in women's and gender studies, we often talk about praxis, which is sort of putting theory, into practice, like applying theories and applying methodologies to try to improve people's lives. So I would say, think about how do we apply intersectionality and how can we use it? And I think other people will speak a little bit more specifically about what that looks like. But think about intersectionality as something that you can try to apply in all aspects of your work and life to try to improve outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Vicki, we have a question for you. So disability is not always mentioned in the larger discussions of intersectionality. Why do you think that is?
I think that there are several reasons. One, I think there's an assumption that we have pretty good laws that protect the rights of people with disabilities and avoid discrimination. But I think the challenge is that part of the biggest barrier to people with disabilities is something that we would call ableism. Everybody has an ism here. And ableism is a preference to hiring people without a disability because there is either a misunderstanding of the capabilities of different types of disabilities, or the fear of having to provide a reasonable accommodation that might be costly and more expensive. So I think that that we need to work in organizations like ADA, Disability Rights North Carolina, that look at the rights of people with disabilities. I think we need to also focus on kind of the capacities and the benefits of hiring someone with a disability, rather than making it a requirement, making it a preference because of skill set.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that insight. Senator Batch, so your question is, how do you use intersectionality in your legislative work when you have colleagues that completely disagree with you with your position on a piece of legislation?
Which probably doesn't surprise all of you all if you listen to the news. Like, does anyone agree on anything now? I mean, regardless of what political party you're in, there's infighting in both the parties all the time. So I do come into, and this happens a lot. I think the way that I approach it, and have in the past, is a perfect example would be there are a disproportionate amount of children in foster care who also are children of color, who are not adopted and are not placed back with family and reunified at the same rate as children who are white. We also don't fund foster care at the rate that we should. We actually have one of the lowest funded foster care systems in the entire country. And so that puts us in a situation as well where we don't have the services and the programs to help families and to help children with regards to them being successful. I have a lot of colleagues who are passionate about wanting to make sure that we have permanency for children in foster care, meaning that as soon that we figure out how they get home as quickly or find a permanent home as quickly as possible. But they don't have the skill set, the wherewithal, and it's not their expertise on how to do that. And they also haven't had, again, I'm the only child welfare law specialist in the legislature out of 170 individuals. And they don't have that expertise. My role in what I think I can do is I can bring the people who live this experience every single day So families that are in the foster care system, foster parents who have experienced it, and most importantly, the foster children, and meet with legislators who are actually the ones who are making the major decisions, right? We all know how politics works. The party in power is the party in control. And so I work very closely with colleagues who are aligned in the fact that they want better outcomes. And to be honest with you, this is how I see the vast majority of people in politics. Like you go into it for the right reasons. We believe fundamentally, like we need to get to, like, we should improve people's lives. The way we improve them, we disagree, sometimes very staunchly on how we get to there. But with foster care, it's one of those topics of nobody wants more kids in foster care, but there are people who don't know how to get them out of foster care or how to go ahead and put them in the most safe and appropriate placements, or to see that there's such a disproportionate impact on kids of color and how they stay in the system longer, right? So I worked with an organization that has a lot of foster youth who are advocates who go through this amazing program called Say So. And we had a legislative day where I brought a lot of my colleagues to the table and we had a roundtable discussion, and they heard from the foster youth about what foster care means to them, what their experiences have been, and seeing the faces of my colleagues who I know because of my work in representing kids and parents in foster care, that I know that in fact, kids can be in 12, 13, 15 different placements. Hearing it from a child who has been in place that many times made a complete difference, right? And so I think that it's really important for us to get out of our own way and to realize that if you actually get the people, there's been lots of talk about people that are closest to the pain should be closest to the power. If you bring those individuals who have those experiences, that have actually had to go through it and are still living it, to those decision makers who have the power, I think that you have a better shot of getting positive legislation that will affect them in a much more positive light, because it's hard, in my opinion, to hate people up close. And so if you bring those individuals into a room and you knock down people's walls and you meet them where they are, you can really make some movement in positive directions with regards to the betterment of individuals. And so foster care is an easy one, but I've had to do that also in the education space. I've done it with regards to, any issues, name the litany of issues that we have with regards to women's issues of not equal pay, not having bodily autonomy, and having restrictions with regards to access to abortion care, et cetera. And while some of those we're never going to agree on, depending on what side of the aisle you sit on, it doesn't mean that you can't sit down and try and make inroads with those who will actually listen and meet people to see how, again, the unintended consequences of laws that we pass have ended up playing out in pretty devastating ways. And the last thing that I will say is I think it's also really important when people are trying to figure out what to do and how to work with people across the aisle, is you find people who are the best messengers. You might not always be the best messenger, right? Like you, and sometimes protesting or screaming and being the loudest person in the room isn't always the most effective. Finding a constituent of a legislator on an issue that they are passionate, that you're passionate about passing, and having that person talk to the person who is their legislator can be very powerful and effective. And we've seen that with regards to the movement on Medicaid expansion in particular in the state. And so I think that over time, people just have to be really creative about how we try and break down people's walls, and then use words that are not, that do not automatically have people run back into their corners. And sadly, we live in a world where there are too many of those words, and soon we're, not going to apparently be able to communicate with words, I fear. But I do think that it's important as we move forward to try and remember, at least when I have my legislative hat on, that I was sent to Raleigh for the sole purpose of making the lives of my constituents better. And sometimes that means that I can't be that messenger for whatever reason, and that we have to go ahead and have some other individuals, take the victory lap and take credit, just so long as the idea gets done.
Definitely. And thank you for that. Like that is I love how you are bringing people who are experiencing it to come and talk to people actually making the legislation, actually deciding it. But kind of something that I was thinking about, and that relates to what you said earlier in your portion of speaking, and during this this question to the one I asked, I guess, how would you say that, what is your opinion on kind of I'm trying to see how to phrase this, diversity of those in political power in general. Like we see there's a disproportionate kind of amount of those who are in power compared to, like, the representation of the people. Do you think that having a more diverse set of people creating these laws can also help take into account much easier the experiences of people of color, people with their sexuality, their ethnicity, their religion, if they're disabled, if they have disability or not? Like, do you think that can play a role in help eliminating the ignoring of intersectionality and those impacts?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, we have a legislature that is less than 25% women, despite the fact that we make up 51% of the voting population, right? No one is surprised by that. We are a part-time legislature, so you get paid $13,900 a year with a stipend. And so if you want an educator, if you want somebody that's a bus driver, if you want anyone that has a blue-collar job, they're not going to be able, even a doctor. The majority of North Carolinians, unless you are self-employed or have a fantastic boss, cannot work at the legislature with regards to it being basically a full-time job for very little money. Now, whether or not that's intentional, I would argue that it's intentional, so that it prevents those individuals, right, to actually serve in the legislature is extremely problematic. And so what we have is disproportionately a lot of older and retired individuals who are serving in the legislature, and wealthy people. And oftentimes they're one and the same. And it's predominantly and overwhelmingly white with a very small percentage. We had one Latino member out of 170 members in the legislature, and he lost his election last time, right? It is, if you are not at the table, if you don't have to talk to people and see people that look like you and live outside of your space and challenge yourself and get to know someone that does not look like you every single day, it is very easy to have tunnel vision and to realize that it is not your problem, right? Because you don't experience it. And when you have to be around other individuals, when my son came to the legislature for his, spring break and went and hung out with me for a day, people remember, oh, wait, you're actually like of childbearing years and you also have young kids, and it's not somebody's grandchildren. Those are experiences that we don't have enough in the building. And I think that we need to have a much more diverse group of individuals. We, to my knowledge, don't have anyone physically from the developmental disabilities community, right? We all know that there are internal disabilities, like Vicki said before, that you cannot see. But when you talk about, we had a wheelchair bound member. He is no longer one of our senators. He lost his election last time. And so it is overwhelmingly old and white men that are making the laws for the state of North Carolina. And I believe a good government should look like the people it serves. And that means you got to have blue collar, white collar, upper, lower, middle class. You have to have everyone from all walks of life, because that's when we have better laws. And you've actually seen this in the boardrooms too. It doesn't just happen with law. Like, more laws are passed when women have been the majority of a legislature, or the more women that are in elected office. Laws that are passed are actually more family friendly, and they help the vast majority of people. Boardrooms, if they have more women in them, the boards are more successful and the businesses are more successful and they make more money, right? It's science. Like, I'm not making it up. We already know it's there, but we have to push individuals to give them a chance. Just like Vicki said, it's easy with ableism. Oh, I don't have to worry about X, Y, and Z. I don't have to give you an accommodation. We couldn't even get pregnancy accommodations in the state of North Carolina for pregnant women at work, because that is not what the business community, there are big people that have pushed back on that. So if we can't figure out a way to go ahead and push for more inclusivity among all people, then we are going to continue to bang our heads against the wall and then have, again, unintended consequences for the vast majority of the marginalized communities that disproportionately are affected by the laws that we pass, because we continue to ignore them and their lived experience.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes a lot of sense. When you have a lack of representation, there's a lack of consideration for those experiences. So it's definitely unfortunate to see that that's how many, if not most or all, I feel like legislative processes in the United States is ran where it's not fairly represented of its population, which is, like I said, extremely unfortunate, and therefore is lacking in understanding of all experiences in everyone's walks of life. Now, to kind of tie back in, I wanted to bring back in Dr. Vigil, and I wanted to get your opinion on about, more of a broader education of what intersectionality is, of trying to reach, those who are, in school and high school, middle school, whatnot, colleges, going past maybe the more like a theoretic, I guess, not only being in more theoretical classes or like sociology, anthropology, women, gender, and sexuality studies. Like, I feel like when it comes to intersectionality, that discussion may not be as brought up in a lot of other fields. And so do you think that maybe a more comprehensive education, for people to understand that better, understand its impacts, would kind of help this fight for human rights across the board? Do you think that it would at least bring a proper attention and proper definition to intersectionality? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I actually want to say, I think we need intersectionality to be talked about from various different fields, which is to say that I actually think I would love to hear more. I think I would have a lot to learn from intersectional perspectives from the field of psychology, from the medical field. So things like that. So in that sense, I'm very happy for it to move outside of, like humanities fields or women's and gender studies. I think there's a lot that, intersectionality is about understanding, various facets of experiences. And so just to use an example from the medical field, and I don't know how much, my hunch is it still happens, but for a long time, medical studies that were performed on men were simply assumed to apply to women, right? And so, like drug testing, or, I think one classic example is heart attacks, right? Heart attacks look different, they manifest differently in male bodies than in female bodies, to some extent. And so the idea that led to, of course, like misdiagnosis and overlooking. And so I think that's one example in which intersectionality is really needed in the medical field. So things like that, or, we could think about another example would be in terms of disability and mental health. Autism also oftentimes it looks very different based on gender, and it can also look very different based on racial norms and experiences. And so that's an example where I think not understanding how gender might impact someone's experiences or expressions of autism, really overlooks. So one class, autism is often underdiagnosed in women and girls, right? Because the assumption is that it looks a particular way. So that's an example of the ways in which I think intersectionality really needs to move into different fields. And it really plays into so much of our world, right? And the services that we want to provide, medical advancements, all of those things. The other thing I want to say is that intersectionality, I think, is also about questioning your assumptions, right? So I think some of those examples, like the examples of medical testing, what assumptions are being made if you have a drug that's only being tested on one subset of the population, right? You're assuming that these results will apply. You're assuming that that there's going to be no difference according to, let's say, gender. So I think that's another way of getting at, like, thinking about where, if you want, whose experiences are you meeting, but then also what are you assuming? And we talk a lot about how oftentimes the assumed subject is a white male subject, right? And I think that's true in those examples that I just gave. So questioning one's assumptions, I think, is another way to implement intersectionality.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for that response. And yeah, it's very fascinating kind of how, when I think of intersectionality, like I talk about them in my humanities classes, I'm not really hearing my like STEM counterparts discuss them as much, even though, of course, those experiences are still there. Like from the analytical framework of intersectionality, it doesn't just go away because you're not like in a humanities kind of field. Like, no, it's about the experience and the experience of the person, not the identity of the person, but the experience. And so it's just really interesting to think about kind of how it's so broad, yet I feel like it's not talked about wide enough in all of like academic circles and just all circles in general, to like fully understand its implications and impacts. But I wanted to go to Vicki, because you mentioned kind of this lack of understanding for gender-based diagnoses of like autism. I know ADHD is also very similar. I mean, I've had a friend who was straight up told by someone, like by their psychiatrist, that ADHD was a little boy's disease, and so she couldn't possibly have it. And, you know, and so gender-based kind of discrimination, especially in the disability realm, and then also the lack of understanding with women's bodies. You know, there's endometriosis, so many like chronic illnesses that women are more prone to, just because of our hormones being different for men. I guess, like, how do you see, and like, how does the ADNC, you know, help women, or, you know, assigned female, you know, people who are assigned female at birth, kind of help overcome these processes that aren't really there to assist them as much as their male counterparts?
So, so many things have been said. I'm having kind of difficulty zeroing in on how this all fits. I think when it comes to people with disabilities, I think first and foremost, the fact that there are so many people out in the world who have very significant disabilities, but you can't see them. So then their behavior, for example, is misunderstood. I think that who provides, and this all comes into gender roles too, who provides the caregiving? And typically, and not surprisingly, it's often women who are the caretakers for family members, or are hired by people with disabilities to help them be more independent. And one of the things that I see in our office is more and more that is shifting, and that we see more men get involved in supporting. And when I say caretaking, I mean helping them live more independently and still provide them a lot of dignity. But it is becoming increasingly challenging to find people to be caretakers for folks with disabilities, both at home, but out in the world, in work, in community life, because of the cost. You know, many people with disabilities live on benefits, so it's sometimes extremely difficult for them to find good support services to help with their independence. Did that answer your question?
A little bit. I guess, like, I was trying to get to like kind of the experience of like a person like assigned female at birth, as well as like with disability. That experience is a bit different. But I mean, that might be more too much of like a medical like type of like question, like geared towards the medical field itself and like the issues within research there. But I mean, I know from like my understanding and of talking with a bunch of people, like women or assigned female at birth, people who have disabilities, it took them a long time to get diagnoses and like proper treatment, because it was like swept under the rug, or it was just deemed, oh, it's just your period, or it's in your head kind of stuff. And so I think it's definitely an interesting experience, especially when a lot of those tend to be invisible disabilities as well, like chronic illnesses and whatnot.
And by invisible, I think we're talking about behavior, which is visible, but frequently you can't find something in the blood work, for example, or you can't address it with some type of device. And so it is challenging. And there are an awful lot of stereotypes out there specific to people with disabilities and what you can and cannot do. Some of it's history, some of it in the movies, So we have a specific idea of someone who's visually impaired or blind and what they need. So where's their seeing eye dog? And thinking that any dog out there must be working with someone who's blind, but yet we know that service animals and support animals and comfort animals are critical. So I know a person whose support animal is a snake. Wouldn't work for me, but it does work for that individual. And I think it's really being open to talking with, listening to, and taking direction from the person who is going to be using and taking advantage of the support.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for your response, Vicki. And so just kind of like for our final little piece, in about a minute or so, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to kind of give one final call to action that you would like the audience to leave with. So Dr. Vigil, if you want to start.
Thank you. Sorry, I wasn't totally ready. Okay. Yeah, I think just going back to what I said before, maybe questioning assumptions, right? When you think about who are you assuming, yeah, if you're, are you holding a meeting in a building that doesn't have elevators, right? So you on the second floor of a building that doesn't have elevators. So you're making assumptions about folks' physical abilities. Are you holding an event, but not providing childcare, right? So then you're making assumptions about folks' caregiving status. So that would be my takeaways is, question your own assumptions and try to think, from a more sort of like 360 viewpoint for who you're going to be talking to and what audience you're trying to reach.
Yeah, thank you so much. Senator Batch, if you want to go next.
Yeah, I would just say that in all that we do, and very similar to Dr. Vigil, when you are questioning your assumptions, also look for unintended consequences. So just because something doesn't affect you doesn't mean that it doesn't affect somebody else. And if that is the case, what actions and what steps are you doing in your own life, whether through your own advocacy, whether it's through being a friend, a parent, an employer, coworker, an advocate in any way, shape, or form, or being an employer. How is it that your actions can make it so that the vast majority of individuals that you are serving and are working with are actually benefiting, and that you can just be honest about where your own assumptions are and your own bias are. Like we are all imperfect individuals, and so I would just ask people to just get out of the guilt space. If you find out that you have an assumption that is not helpful, process it, move on, and be better. Like every single day you have the opportunity to be a better person than you were yesterday. And if you are doing that and you're doing it with an open heart and a mind, trying to include as many people as possible and not assuming that they're trying to get one over on you, and giving a little bit more grace in this world, which everyone deserves, I think that we'll have much better outcomes for the vast majority of people. So that wasn't one piece of advice. I guess that was like 12 and
Thank you so much, Senator Batch. We really appreciate that. And Vicki, if you want to close us off with a final call to action.
Sure. I think that if for people listening to this, if you have a question or you want to know if a person with a disability needs assistance, ask them. Just ask. Don't assume. I ask, and sometimes a lot of people will say, no, thank you. And it's like, okay, don't be offended and don't be afraid to say, can I help you? Could I open the door? Could I hold the door for you? Don't, in a weird sort of way, don't just do it. Ask what they need. Don't assume.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. Thank you guys all for those fantastic call to actions and reminders on how to, try to accommodate all from all lives, like from all, backgrounds and walks of life, from all identities. Thank you so much for joining WomenNC this evening. And thank you so much, Dr. Vigil, Ms. Smith, and Senator Batch for helping educate the community on what intersectionality is and why it matters. I hope you guys have a great rest of your evening. And I hope those who came in and watched and those who are watching in the future have enjoyed talking about what is intersectionality.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.